When you watch the TV shows, you think, hey, the investigator goes right on the scene, walks right into the crime scene. It can take hours for them to get that search warrant. So they're just standing outside waiting to be able to go inside and do their job. Now, in this particular case, there's no forensic evidence connecting Chris Sutton to the shootings. And the defense says the only reason Chris is on trial is because the real killer implicated Chris to save himself. So what does that mean to both sides? With me to break things down is attorney and former detective Donald Schweitzer. Donald, great to have you with us. And Donald, as I look at this particular case, let's say you're the prosecutor in this case. Your primary piece of evidence is your primary witness is a convicted killer, Garrett Kopp, and he's basically saying someone else did it. Is that tough to handle as a prosecutor for your case? Because I have to imagine you got to convince the jury that a convicted killer is telling the truth and not to get himself off.
Ryan, I can't sugarcoat this one. I think that this is a very difficult case for the prosecution. You've got not only a convicted felon, but his story doesn't make sense. He basically tells the police that he murdered because somebody had threatened to kill his family if he didn't murder. And in this particular case, it doesn't make sense. He was also given a deal. So I think that the prosecution's got an uphill battle if this is their key piece of evidence. But remember, they're relying on circumstantial evidence, which entails a lot of other things.
Right, and there's no forensic connection here. So when you talk about the circumstantial evidence in this case, tell us, if you're the prosecutor on this case, how do you convince a jury to get past the lack of forensic evidence and say there is that connection, even though Garrett Kopp could be viewed by the jury as somebody who's trying to save his own skin?
Well, initially, Ryan, that's not a problem for any prosecutor. Prosecutors are really trained to love circumstantial evidence and trained to teach juries that circumstantial evidence is good. But that circumstantial evidence has to be compelling. And in this case, I think that the prosecution, again, has a problem because, you know, part of the circumstantial evidence is that the defendant nursed his father after this. And there could be some sympathy for that. The physical evidence doesn't mean anything because this is a murder for hire. If there was physical evidence, then the prosecution would have a problem. But you're looking at the big picture, seeing if there's a puzzle that they could put together for the jury.
You know, Donald, there's another piece of this case that I think could end up being a problem for the prosecution, and that is there was a police interrogation in this case of Garrett Kopp, 9 to 10 hours long, talking to him about what's going on. He's not saying anything, and eventually we find out from reading some of the interrogation materials that he eventually points the finger at Christopher Sutton. And they've got the sworn statement, but they don't have seems like they don't have the bulk of the rest of the examination or interrogation. Does that seem a little bit iffy to you, and could that be a problem for the prosecution in terms of maybe coercion of this particular witness?
I think that's always going to be a question when you've got an interrogation that's long. Police interviews are an art, and some people are really good at it, other people aren't, and believe it or not, there's some cops out there that are trying to do their best, but they're just not good at interviewing people and trying to get statements from folks. I'd actually have to listen to the entire interview in its entirety to pass on this one, which I haven't, but I do think that you raise an important issue for the prosecution. It looks like it could be a problem.
Yeah, and by the way, Donald, you're a former police officer. I want to talk to you about the crime scene. We just heard one of the investigators talk about how they got there. They saw Susan clutching that blanket over her. They also took a look at the scene. Based on what you've heard so far, how would you approach this crime scene? What would you gather from it, especially the impression of Susan Sutton holding that blanket over her face and clutching it with her fists?
Yeah, Ryan, that's a very compelling testimony. I think for the sympathy of the jury, you've got a victim that's clutching her hands like this, and that tells me that she was probably awake, she was frightened, and she was probably in a great deal of pain at the time that she had her hands up like that. That's good evidence for the prosecution because you want the jury to feel sorry for that victim.
Okay, Donald, you know, you're a former police officer as well as a former prosecutor. We look at this case, and I'm sure some of our viewers are thinking, well, when I see CSI and shows like that, I think, well, you arrive on the scene, you get there because the evidence can get stale, things can happen. You got to get in there and examine the evidence quickly. But in this case, they waited hours for that search warrant to come in. Is that something you've seen happen normally in the crime scenes you've examined? And when it does that affect the evidence at all?
It's not unusual at all. The key thing about the police is they have to lock up the crime scene and make sure that it's not contaminated. The problem in this case is that the SWAT team came in there because they had to. They had to go in there and search it and make sure that there wasn't anybody in there. But locking it up and making sure nobody comes in or out without some identification and not messing up the scene is more important than examining things right away. So I'm not bothered at all by the fact that there were some hours to get a search warrant before they get in there and start taking pictures and swabbing things.
All right, now, Donald, you're the prosecutor on this case. Let me put you in their shoes for a second. And I look at this case. You know about the Garrett Kopp situation and what he said against Chris Sutton. How would you, if you're in the prosecution's shoes, talk to the jury about this? You've got Garrett Kopp. You've got, it looks like his girlfriend might be testifying against Chris Sutton as well. How do you get past the forensic evidence and get the jury to see that Chris Sutton may have been up to something and been involved in this crime?
You have to focus on his anger. You have to focus on his statements to people that he was looking for somebody to kill somebody. I mean, that's very compelling. Brought in his girlfriend up there, who you would think would be loyal, would be a key witness. You have to really bring out the anger of this young man. He was put into a camp when he was young, never got over it. He was a very bitter person, and he had a motive. That's the way that you would approach this case.
All right, the motive. We've already seen the prosecutor talking about that motive, focusing on that first. Donald, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right, well, we're in the second day of the Chris Sutton murder trial. In just a few minutes.